So last week, we talked about the call and tension of discipleship, and this was really a kind of state of the union of what it means to make disciples in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, and beyond. And there is a huge tension that a lot of us are overcommitted, very busy. We're stressed out. We're anxious, right? We have cell phones attached to our hips, and we've got urgent and important information on our Instagram feeds we have to get to. And so I understand the tension. I hope you feel like you felt that I was joking there. I know it's early, especially early. Oh, by the way, thanks for also getting up an hour early. Like, that's also another barrier to you being here, and you're here. So hey, give yourself a hand. Yeah, congratulations if you're single. If you have kids, you were up 5 hours ago, like I was. And so we had the State of the Union, and now we're kind of pulling back, and we want to look at what this looks like for whole life discipleship, particularly what it means to be someone who has influence in all their spheres, wherever they live, whether that's their work, where they play, where their gym is, within their families and such. Well, let me give you a little framework. Now, during World War II, we obviously won World War II, right? We were rebuilding the country, and this generation that was rebuilding the country was called the Greatest Generation. And they're called the Greatest Generation because they beat the Nazis, right? They beat Japan. That's great. But they began to, after 1945 or so, they began to rebuild the country. And as they did this, they built things like roads. A lot of our roads that were constructed then, and they built suburbs. And suburbs have a crazy history to them, but essentially they were trying to create a utopian area outside of the city where they can all function and flourish, and that was kind of the overarching purpose of these. And within this, the World War II veterans, the people that came out of the war, they were building rigid societal structures as a result as well. Very rigid. Now think about it. If you fought in World War II, you're probably not playing around, okay? There's not a lot of room for joking and nuance. So when they built their society and they were rebuilding, they built rigid structures and rule systems. And they were probably quite military-like, right? Makes sense. They weren't playing around. They fought World War II. Now their children, the baby boomers, they didn't see it the same. And some of you are baby boomers. They actually felt different about the way their societal structures. After all, they didn't fight in World War II. All they saw were the rigid rules of society, and they began to rebel, particularly in the 1960s. 1960s, the story goes, some of you were there, you know what it was like, okay? It was a different time. The sexual revolution became a thing. Large-scale abandonment of cultural norms, and particularly Judeo-Christian ethics was a thing. People were kind of force-fed Judeo-Christian ethics all throughout history, particularly in the 1950s. It was part of life. You came back from the war, you were a Christian family, you moved to the suburbs, you went to church on Sundays, and you lived your life. That's how life was. And so as the boomers got older, they started to say, hey, I don't really know a ton about what you're trying to tell me to do. I don't know if I believe the same things you believe. Now, rebellion began to come in. Now, if the societal structures were too strict in the 1940s and 50s, they were too lax in the 60s with the next generation. And so there was an overcorrection of the market. Now, socioeconomic, people who talk about sociology and talk about histories and generations, they talk like this, and particularly in regards to like a worldview, a religious worldview. They'll say one generation will establish that worldview. One generation established that worldview. The next generation assumes that worldview. And then the third generation forgets the worldview. They were never taught the worldview. And so when it comes to Judeo-Christian ethics, the greatest generation, they established that ethic. The next generation began to assume it. They assumed it was true. They assumed it took place. They assumed you went to church. And then we're finding ourselves kind of at the back end of a Generation X, millennials, kind of that coming of age tale where we've largely forgotten what these Judeo-Christian ethics are and what they mean. And so we're at this exact point. Now, what they say is that after this third generation, typically it resets itself and it clears the way for a spiritual revival, that actually spiritual revival can take place at the back end of a generation that has forgotten Judeo-Christian ethics or Christianity. Yeah? And so that changed history. And what happened kind of at the back end of this generation was the technological revolution, right? Now, 15 years ago, I got my first cell phone in 2001. It weighed a pound. It was very heavy. And the screen was that big. And the phone was like that big, and you're like, what is all that other stuff for? I don't know. Like, what is in there? I don't know now. Now the phones are so thin, even though they're thin and they're long, but they're thin. This one was like really thick. It was a brick. You could kill someone with it if you wanted to. It was really big. But the technological revolution was tacked on the back of this other at the end of this generation. And so what this did was it just kind of changed things like crazy. It sped up our processing of information and gave us all sorts of access to other worldviews and ideologies and thought processes. Now, what's interesting about this is that our generation, and many of you know, have kind of gone off the deep end. We've said, you know what, we don't really necessarily know if we believe in Christianity, and we're going to go look for other means of communication, other means of fulfillment, other means of purpose. And we're looking for that in other places. But you know what's interesting at this time in history, this sort of cultural ethos today, is we're actually discovering that our needs for autonomy and technology actually aren't giving us the deepest fulfillment we wanted. We're actually discovering that as a society. We're realizing that, man, if we wanted to be autonomous for 20 plus years, we got our autonomy, we wanted to be technologically advanced, we got our technology, and we're realizing, wait a second, this actually doesn't meet the needs that I'm actually trying to meet. I don't understand. And so with rises of things like anxiety and depression, despite our technology usage going up, despite our human autonomy going up at its pinnacle, our culture is beginning to think that human thought plus technology might not save us after all. You know, people began to apply godlike attributes to technology over the last 10 or 12 years. They said, technology is going to feed humanity. Have you ever heard them say this? This technology is going to feed the world. It's going to solve world hunger. This technology is going to finally meet our needs for community and relationship. Right? That was the championed phrasing of social media. And how's that going? Are your needs for community and family met? No. We're realizing they're not. We're realizing this is what's happening. We have a society thirsty for a solution, and we're realizing that our the societal goal that we set forth actually isn't it. So as a result, we have a society not unwilling to explore other spiritual possibilities. Maybe somebody like Jesus is the answer. Maybe another religion is the answer. This is why we have a rise in a group of people they call spiritual. Right, for a long time, we thought the church was leaving. It turns out people are actually just looking for other spiritual means of fulfillment. And so we have people that say, hey, I'm not Christian. I don't know if I believe in Jesus, but I find myself spiritual, right? And they're having to find the answer elsewhere, even if they think maybe Jesus isn't the actual answer. That's what's happening. So this begs the question, at least for me, why doesn't our church, the church, capital C church, meet the needs of society? Why isn't the church the answer? Why isn't the church the ultimate solution? Why do people not see the church as a solution? Why do people go to church and go, that's not it, I've got to find something else? I was in Portland recently. I spent the entire week there, and as I went around, I saw the religious imagery all over the city of Portland. Religious imagery everywhere. Restaurants called Babylon, which, I don't know. I mean, it seems like a weird name for a restaurant. People like it, right? The halfway house and the seance room. You're like, what do they serve there? Oh, it's tapas, but it's called the seance room. Like, do you get to talk to the dead while you eat? No, but so there's a lot of religious imagery we're hungry for. We mock it, but we also want it. Tarot card readings, that sort of thing. Why isn't the church the answer? Well, I think the church really, and this is no debate, the church has really adopted to a large degree a secular business model where we predict discipleship through a series of top of the funnel metrics like attendance, building size, staff, small groups. And we're trying to game the system, so to speak, and we fashion the church in such a way where if we get enough money, enough people, and a large enough building, and a certain crowd, and we can actually kind of create disciples or at least increase attendance that way. That's what's happening. Do you feel that at all? Maybe you don't. But our culture I think can sense that there isn't continuity between what the Christian faith looks like today as a whole and what the Christian message actually is. I think people are seeing the difference. You see what I'm saying? So here's the tension. We will not see revitalization in our cities without individual believers coming to a deep understanding and practice of something called whole life discipleship. We will not see revitalization, of spiritual revitalization in our cities without individual believers coming to a deep understanding and practice of whole life discipleship. We're going to need to discover that our daily callings, our callings at work, our callings in our families, our callings in recreation, all actually do play a significant role in fulfilling God's mission in the Bay Area. When you get to bring peace into your city, your life matters, not just your time you spend on Sunday morning or another time. In other words, guys, this is going to be a shocker. We're actually going to have to live like Jesus lived. We're going to have to live out our faith in all areas of our life with continuity towards the goal of helping other people come to know him. We're actually going to have to do that. We're not going to be able to game the society or the church's system of making disciples. We're actually going to have to go live it out. Now, I think our modern concept of church, or at least what many of us think church is, including myself, is not sufficient to meet the desperate needs of our culture. More is necessary. And by the way, never has this been more apparent than in Matthew chapter 9. Would you go to verse 35 for me? Let's look at what it says again. This is Jesus. Jesus went throughout all the cities, and listen to this. This is crazy. He went throughout all the cities, cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. So Jesus is out. He's going to the conferences. He's going to the breakout sessions. He's going to churches. He's preaching. He's preaching. He's preaching. He's got a YouTube channel, lots of followers, clips, everything. He's got the great bumpers, good music, probably not the skinny jeans, but he's got everything else. And people are loving it. They're liking it. They're clicking it. They're viewing it. They're seeing it. And then it says here, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. So he's got a healing ministry. He's healing people, okay? And then verse 36, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Jesus Christ is the greatest preacher to ever live. He's the greatest speaker. He is more spirit-filled, okay, than any other preacher. He's more charismatic. He's more dynamic. He's more compelling. He knows just how to hit you. He's the greatest preacher, and yet, after his conference talks, his breakout sessions, all of the sermons he preached, he looked at the crowds, and it says he felt compassion for the crowds because the job wasn't finished, because people were like sheep without a shepherd. In America, we have built entire church denominations, networks, and ministries around ministry methods that Jesus wept over. Jesus looked out the crowd and said, we love preaching, it's great, but it's not sufficient to make disciples. And here's where Matthew 9, 35 through 38 comes in, is that we actually need shepherds, not just preachers. In America, we need shepherds, not just preachers, in order to get the job done. And listen, I'm a preacher. Sermons are good. We love sermons. I love sermons. I mean, that's what I do for a living, okay? I really, really like preaching. It's a very good thing, but the church sometimes can accidentally take the pulpit, and instead of making it one of the most important things, makes it the only thing in the church. That what we're supposed to do is, to make disciples, we come sit under good preaching, and if we want to make more disciples, we bring people to hear good preaching. All great things. And if that's not enough, we look up other great preachers online and send those preachers to other people. Preaching? Great. Love preaching. We need shepherds, not just preachers. And that's where you come in. Yeah? This is where you come in. Many of us, including myself, we've all had this idea that the faith walk is this. We pray a prayer, we go to a good church, we hear a good sermon, and then we volunteer. All good things, but all not sufficient for what Jesus had in mind for discipleship. And we have built church models where ways you actually grow is a private Bible reading and volunteering. And if you do those things, you're in. Good things, trust me. Insufficient. By the way, if you want to volunteer, you can sign up today to help us. That would be awesome, okay? Great things. But here's my hope. My hope is that you begin to see yourself not just as a volunteer, but as a disciple of Jesus. Not just as a volunteer, but as a disciple of Jesus. What's the difference? A volunteer is someone who does something for free. We need volunteers. They're great. But typically, this implies, if we think of ourselves as volunteers, that we are entering into a new space from the space we were, and then once the volunteering is done, we go back into the space that we came from, okay? But a disciple is not one who does something. It's one who, by nature, is something. It's one whose nature is changed, and therefore everything about them is changed, and everything they say and do is changed as a result. A disciple is a called worker Meeting need is in their nature, not just something they do. You understand? So, being a person of irresistible influence in your city, in your spheres of influence, is about intersecting gospel intentionality into everyday life. What does that mean? It means you are living and breathing the gospel of Jesus, the message of the cross, that Jesus lived a life that we should have lived, that he died a death that we should have died, that he rose 3 days later, conquering death, conquering evil, conquering sin. That we would live that out in our lives with people seeing us around us. Making a disciple has to essentially bleed into everything we do. It's not an event we attend. The church is not an event we attend. It's a people we are. And that is this is where we fundamentally miss what the church was always supposed to be. The church is not a passive action through listening to a great preacher. It is a thing we do, an intentional act being changed by God, living that out. But how though, right? Like, can we just say, seems crazy. You have 168 hours in a week. That's how many hours. Check my math on that. Pretty sure that's right. Nerds, you probably already know it's right, okay? 56 hours of sleeping, hopefully. You get 56 hours sleeping. Some of you get too much. Some of you don't get enough. But on average, 56 hours of sleeping. Couple hours at church, maybe. And then there's 110 hours of your week remaining. Now, what do you do with that 110 hours? What do you do? Because in our small group this week, we had a really honest conversation. Man, people are busy, we're overworked, we're tired. It's tough, right? What are you doing with your 110 hours? Audit yourself for a moment. Just think about it. What did I do this week? Okay, and if you have screen time on your iPhone, you know how long you're on Instagram and Facebook. But minus that time, because that's fair, just fine. But think about everything else, right? What were you doing? Now, here's the thing. You were likely looking at your life and thinking, man, there is no way I can squeeze anything else into my schedule. You're likely thinking that. I'm thinking that. I have a color-coded calendar. It's organized. It's synced with my wife's. I am trying to squeeze every minute out of my calendar, and yet I'm still feeling overwhelmed. You might feel that too. This means that you're going to have to leverage what you're already doing to make disciples. That means there cannot be any further bifurcation between your faith life and your work life and your life. This cannot be a separate thing any longer. Not in this city, not in this region. It's too hard. So here's the first thing you'll have to do. You'll have to begin to see your vocation as a ministry. Because this is Silicon Valley. It's changed a lot. But most of you are here because you got a job here. I know most of you, so I can say that, right? You're here because you got a job here, right? So you're going to have to spend most of your 110 hours working, right? You probably work 40 plus, 50 plus, some of you 60, even more than that hours a week. Tag on some hours of commuting. That's a lot of time that you're spending working, probably virtually for the next few weeks, but nonetheless, working, right? See, you're going to have to see your work as a ministry. Have you ever considered that your work was a ministry, that your job was a ministry? Have you ever just even had that idea? Did you know that you were sent into your place of work? Like God actually sent you there. You are going to have to see your work as a ministry and as a platform for joining God in his mission of bringing peace to the city. You're going to have to do that. That's God's call on our lives. That means fundamentally that you don't just work at Facebook, you're called to Facebook. You don't just work at Google, you're called to Google. You don't just work at Twitter, you're called to Twitter. You don't just work at UCSF Medical Center, you're called to the UCSF Medical Center. And you don't just go to school at San Francisco State University, you're called into San Francisco State University. And hey, you're not just working, trying to buy your time babysitting as a mother. You actually are called into your family to be a disciple maker for your children. This is the fundamental call of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, a disciple. 1 Corinthians 7, Apostle Paul says this, nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them. Whatever situation. Just as God has called them, this is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Now, Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, and he's saying, hey, whatever you're doing, whatever you're assigned to, you've got to live as a believer in whatever situation. Whatever situation. Now, this is tough for me, okay, because I'm a pastor. And I wasn't a pastor before. I did lots of other things. But now when I'm a pastor, and I mention that, if I'm like at a grocery store or something, and I say, I'm a pastor, the conversation turns really weird, really awkward. First reason is they did not see that coming at all. They were looking at me and going, man, this dude's a UFC fighter. And I'm like, yeah, not anymore, not anymore. Military bodyguard for Mark Zuckerberg, and then I go, pastor, and they go, and then the conversation gets weird and they don't know how to talk to me anymore. And I'm like, hey man, like, do you want to hang out? And they're like, no, not really. All right, fair enough. I've had some success in the gym with that. It works out there better just because, it works. So I'm able to hang out, but it's awkward. But for you, you don't have that. You can say, hey, I'm a product development manager. I'm a software engineer. I'm a marketing manager. Yeah, I'm a stay-at-home mom. Yeah, I go to school here. Yeah, I work at this coffee shop. And you have that ability to then have conversations with people in your spheres of influence, be able to make friends in those moments. It's a great, great opportunity to be called into it. And then you get to define the vision for your vocation. Oftentimes we look at our vision for our vocation and we think, my vision is to put this much money in the bank. My vision is to get this much in my 401k. My vision is to be a VP at this company or to own this much stock or to go public. I've got a financial vision for my job, but I do not have a spiritual vision for my job. But that's where you spend the most of your time, don't you understand? Most of your time's there. So in order for you to be as effective as a disciple maker as you can, you've got to begin to see your work as a place where you're primarily called, not just one where you're employed. The only way we're going to seek authentic transformation in our city is to enter our faith into our work. This is the only way it's going to happen in this city. Now, if we were in Little Rock, Arkansas, or Wichita, Kansas, or Lincoln, Nebraska, or especially Dallas, Texas, it would be a lot different conversation. But in the Bay Area, the only way we're going to see authentic spiritual transformation in the Bay Area is through people taking their faith into their work. It's the only way this is going to happen. The days of faith and work being separated and seeing churches filled on Sunday is absolutely unequivocally over. It's over. If you grew up in another place in the Midwest or the South or whatever, and you went to a church and you never mentioned Jesus, maybe at school or whatever, and you went to your church and it was filled, like, man, there's so many people there, this is great. Those days in the Bay Area, they're over. In fact, San Francisco's never had a day where it's been that way. Never. And it's especially going to be worse because our city is a city of authenticity. It wants to see the real you, and it can sniff it out if it's phony. People here just can. They do not want to see separated lives. Once you've entered your faith into your work, you're going to then see something different happen at your work. You're going to see your levels of influence change. You're going to make change with other people. And then you're going to be able to see not just your faith enter your work, but people from your work enter your faith. And then you're going to see coworkers come into a place like this, even as a skeptic, and challenge a sermon, and then go to lunch and coffee after and say, hey, I don't know if I agreed with that. Talk to me about that. I didn't like that. And you're going to be able to open the Bible and say, hey, this is what I believe. Wouldn't that be cool if we did that? Now, I'm not saying no one is doing that. Of course, I know many of you are. But this is the way we're going to seek authentic transformation. And then you're going to be able to utilize the Holy Spirit to bring further transformation in them. You don't have to bear all of that yourself. God could have chosen any number of ways to influence your family, your place of work, or your school, but he chose you. If you're here, and I know not everyone here calls himself a Christian, I totally understand that. If that's you, man, you're going to hear a little bit of inside baseball today. You're going to hear what it's like for us to have these sort of conversations. And I think there's value in that for you to see how Christians think. But if you call yourself a believer in Jesus, he could have called anybody, but he chose you. If you are here, we talked about it last week, you have a standing order to make disciples from Jesus. And he doesn't just choose you, he sends you. John chapter 20, verse 21. He says, Jesus said to them again, he's talking to his disciples after he resurrected. He says, as the Father sent me, so even so I am sending you. You. Now today we think it says, as the Father sent me, so I am now sending your pastor. As the Father sent me, so I'm now sending your city group leader. As the Father sent me, so I'm now sending your YouTube preacher, Stephen Furtick. You name it. Whoever you watch, that's who you believe God sent into the world to make disciples. But I'll tell you what, he didn't send them, he sent you. We say it all the time in our kind of our rally moments before. Hey, God might not use the sermon to change somebody, but he might use your conversations with them. He's chosen you. You have just as much ability to influence the world as any preacher standing on any stage, no matter how many people are listening to them. It's just true. Not pastor, not YouTube preacher, not your group leader, you. This means you have a tremendous opportunity to be influential. Tremendous opportunity. Think about it. Work is where you demonstrate tangible traits that, man, quite honestly, a lot of people don't have these days, okay? Self-control much? Wouldn't self-control be great? As a believer, you have an ability to demonstrate self-control at work. You can be self-controlled when a boss gets angry, when a coworker flakes. You have an ability to be self-control. How about patience? You have an ability to demonstrate patience on a BART train where it can try your patience. You can patiently let people go on and off with your coworkers and your friends nearby. Resiliency when things get tough, when things get difficult, when companies turn over, when you get new jobs. Joy in the midst of economic uncertainty. In the midst of companies going haywire when there's economic corrections, let alone recessions, what would it look like for you to be joyous in the midst of all circumstances, is the way scriptures talk about? Say, listen, it's an uncertain time, but I just believe that I worship a God that can make change. I just believe that's true. And they go, listen, I don't know if I believe that, but I want some of that joy. That's what people will be saying. It's an amazing ability. Now, you know people are overcommitted too. You know what one thing people that are overcommitted rarely do? What's one thing overcommitted people almost never do? They do what they say they're going to do. You all are that. You're flaky. Just call it what it is. We flake out all the time because I put too much on my calendar. Oh man, I'm the chief of this. I've got this, and this on my calendar. I can't say no. I love people, and I take it all on, and then 4 hours before, it's like, oh gosh, I can't do this. Hey, big head, I can't make it. I'm already there. Oh yeah, no, not gonna be there. And then Instagram, they see you're hanging out at a party, and you're like, what the heck? Because it's not that you didn't like them, it's that you were committed to two things, right? It's not you were hating on them, you're just too committed. That's what's going on. What if you could be someone who just says, you know what, I'm just gonna do what I say I'm gonna do here at work. I'm actually just, when people invite me somewhere, I'm just gonna go. I'm just gonna show up for people. I'm gonna make a decision daily to show up for my coworkers and my boss. I'm not gonna flake. And then people are gonna go, man, you know what? You're always here. Thank you. Something's different. Like, why are you always here? Everybody cancels. And you have an opportunity for influence there. And then you get to do this. Discover the role that you play in the lives of each individual you come across. Now, I think this is very important. You want to discover the role that you play in the lives of every person you come across. Right? Everyone thinks they're the movie star in planet Earth, right? Like, you're Sean Connery. You're a little young for that, but think about it. Okay? You're a movie star, and everyone else is like a sub-character, right? That's kind of how we kind of think, like Truman Show style, right? You're Jim Carrey, and everyone else is like an extra. And we think about our lives that way sometimes. But what if instead of looking at how everyone else is doing, playing the sub-characters in our life, what if we tried to be the best sub-character in their life for them? What does that look like to do? We often too think that we need a mentor, we need to be the mentor that helps change this person. Think about that friend, that family member that you've desperately wanted, maybe to come to know Jesus, to quit that addiction, to move out of that house, and you're just thinking about that person. You're like, man, I've got to be the one. I've got to help them. I've got the information, right? We want to be that person that helps them. But actually, there are unique ways that we all get to help people. We might not be the main character helping that person. You know, Jesus actually did this. He was a 3-year mentor to many of his disciples, right? For 3 years, he walked alongside them. He was their mentor, their chief mentor. Paul did this with other pastors like Timothy. He was their chief mentor. But Jesus also changed people with one conversation. He had one conversation with Nicodemus. He had one conversation with the blind man. He played healer for the man without legs. He saw his role differently for each individual person. He didn't try to take on the load of mentoring for every single person, right? Now, I suspect all of us feel like we have that same calling. So you have to ask yourself this question: how can I be the best version of me for this person today? How can I be the best version of me for this person today? You know, as a pastor, I've done it for a long time, but where you're just trying to have conversations with people and relate to them. Sometimes you put so much pressure on yourself to be the one that helps them change. Like, I'm going to be the one that finally gets them out of debt. I'm going to be the one that finally helps them. And you might see that in your place of work or amongst your family. Like, I'm going to be the one that helps them. And what happens if they don't do it? It's frustrating. And then you start getting angry. Like, don't you understand what I'm telling you? This can help you. And you get frustrated with it. This person just can't see it, right? It's funny. We take too much of the credit when people do right and too much of the blame when they don't. And this will allow us to not do that because it takes the pressure off of us. You have a small and unique role for every single person. So think about that for a second. With your mother, what's that role? What about with your cousin? What's that role? What about with your coworker? What's that role? What about your longtime college friend that just is a knucklehead? You've been just trying to drag along for the last decade. What's your role with them? It takes the pressure off because you don't have to be the one that saves the person. By the way, we're not God. We get to play our roles. We are an instrument in the hand of a Redeemer, and the Redeemer does the surgery. And we get to find our role and play, and we get to relax and see what small thing you might be able to do. For some things, it might just be one little piece of advice I'm going to give this person. For some, it might just be holding the door open and saying, good morning. What is that small role? Then you want to begin to invite people into what you are already doing. Because remember, 110 hours, commuting, work, a lot of stuff. Travel for work, travel for weddings, travel for just to get away from the Bay Area, to breathe a little bit. All of these things. How are you going to squeeze it in? Why add more when you can demonstrate a godly life to people by doing what you're already doing and inviting them along? Do you go to one of our city groups? What does it look like for you just to invite someone into something you're already doing? Invite your coworker into a city group. Invite them in. Hey, we have dinner, we eat, we hang out, we have fun, we do a little Bible study, and we make friends, we grow a little deeper together. That's all we do. Do you take your kids to the park? Do you take your children to the park? Invite a new family to join you and let them see how you parent. It's actually funny. My kids give me crazy opportunities to make influence. In fact, they do it better than I do. They really do, because they're just not afraid. They don't have that adult fear that we all have of other people. And so my kids will go, hey, I like you. You're officially my friend. Dad, take me to the park with them. And you're like, okay, this is great. And you got to meet some parents, and you're like, okay, how's it going? Turns out I really like these parents. They're pretty cool. We're friends now. My knucklehead son, who I was angry at for doing this, now made me some friends. Isn't that pretty cool? This is amazing. My daughter, 3 years old, sings Jesus Loves Me. They tell her in her school, they say, you're supposed to, every Tuesday, you have to sing a song. And for like show and tell, it's a song. And she sings Jesus Loves Me. If you never heard that song, I never heard that song until I met my wife. I was 23 years old when I heard that song. I just grew up in the Bay Area. And my 3-year-old daughter yells it every Tuesday at like 1 o'clock for their thing. And then my wife picks them up, and the lady's like, your daughter, she sings Jesus Loves Me all the time. This is crazy. And my daughter is like showing people what it means to like love Jesus, and she doesn't even know it. They have more courage than us. It's amazing. But she's discovering what role she's going to play, and she's just doing her thing, right? Do you go to church this Sunday? You go to church, right? You can invite people into that. Do you eat lunch? Do you eat lunch? You eat. You're here, you're alive, you eat. Okay? Bring someone into that. Bring friends into that relationship. Do you eat dinner? Man, we're going to talk about the fellowship table on another sermon. Having a dinner and inviting people into that and letting them see how you talk to your children, talk to your spouse, talk to your friends. It's a great way to help make disciples. Invite people into your lives. Now, we get this idea that we're not supposed to be an example to other people, that maybe we're fearful that, especially in Christian circles, people think, well, you're not, it's all about Jesus. We don't look at people. And Paul says, 1 Corinthians 11, he says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. It's a great opportunity to help bring somebody along by living a godly life. It's a great opportunity to do that. Now, does this mean there is no space for formal discipleship training or Bible studies, things like that? Of course not. In fact, that's what we'll be talking about next week. But oftentimes we think only of formalities. Church, small group, Bible study. Church, small group, Bible study. And it's in boxes that we think like that. Discipleship is far more scattered than this. And oftentimes, when we think about these boxes of discipleship, these scenarios want to impress people with our knowledge. And so we say, I was listening to here's my favorite sentence now to declare your authority. I was listening to this one podcast, and now all of a sudden, you're an expert on neuroscience because we heard a podcast. It's like, oh my goodness. But I do the same thing, right? We're all guilty of this. But in these scenarios, we want to impress with our knowledge. And it's probably better to impress with our lives so then we can influence people with our knowledge. One of my mentors a long time ago when I was younger and I just started in ministry about 10 years ago, he said, "Hey, Eddie, I know that you're really smart." I was, "Thanks. I know you're really smart, but people want to know that you care before they want to know what you know." And I just would tell people the gospel and never demonstrate that I was changed by it. Last thing, in order to be a person of irresistible influence, you must first be influenced by Jesus. Let's start there. People thought Jesus was crazy. We read just a few weeks ago, people thought Jesus had a demon. Actually, there's certain people today that believe Jesus was a cult leader. But one way they never say Jesus was, they never say he was inauthentic. If he was crazy, if he was demon-possessed, or if he was God, he was authentic, especially those who really knew him. They really knew him. Look again at verse 35 in our text, chapter 9. "And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction." That's what Jesus did. That's authentic. He spent his time going from city to city, village to village, to meet people, to share the gospel with them, to help them heal. He did this. And then he looks out and he says, he saw the crowds. He had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless. He saw the need of people in his region. They're harassed and they're helpless. And then what? Like sheep, without a shepherd. Jesus' compassion for his city was not phony. It was not political. It was authentic. This word compassion really means with the love of the cross. The word passion, right? Passion, the passion of Christ, you've heard of that? It's a sacrificial love, a love that's willing to give it all up, right? With the passion of something like the cross. Our society is too intelligent and too emotionally savvy to fall for fake Christianity any longer. They're going to see and smell whether or not it's authentic. And for those of you that don't know Jesus, you know what I'm talking about. And that's totally fair, by the way, because we want people to be who they say they are. And we know we're not going to be perfect and we're going to fail. And we understand that we sin, that we're not perfect. We get that. But what does that look? What does authenticity? What does authenticity look like in that? It means you apologize. It means you say sorry. It means you repent of your sins. You say, "Hey, listen, I'm not perfect. By God's grace, I've got another opportunity at this." There are people out in our city that are going to need to smell the influence of Jesus on his people before they buy in. There are going to be people that are going to need to see the impact of Jesus on our work and on our families. Paul says, if you can't take care of your own household well, how in the world can we trust you with the church? That's what he tells pastors. You got to be able to disciple your families and your work. And people are going to need to see those that are believers find joy in all things, because that's what the gospel does for us. And if we are wallowing and moping around, and yet we say we believe the gospel, but our lifestyles are moping, it's going to be hard for people to want to follow someone who does that. It'll be very hard. So, as we close, let's just pray that we might all be influenced by Jesus so we can make real change in our lives and our families. Would you do that with me?